Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Robert Lawson, the Full and Wider Centennial Chair in Economic Freedom and the Director of the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom in the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. Last week, we launched this video on economic freedom, and tonight, he's here to address some of our questions about the topic. We joined the interview in progress.
But when I talk about economic freedom, we're talking about an economy, a system based on private property. So that means that the bulk of the resources, land, buildings, factories, farms, are owned by private individuals, and that markets are used. Private markets are used for buying and selling goods and services. Those markets are lightly regulated so that the participants, the buyers and the sellers, can pretty freely buy and sell. And then at the end of the day, if you make any money at this buying and selling, you can keep a good portion of it. So economic freedom is basically the freedom to go about your economic life with your private property and keep the fruits of your labor. And my job and the project that I work in is to try to score countries, try to put a number on how much of this economic freedom thing is in your country. Because some countries have more private property and others have less. Some countries have markets that are more free and open, and other countries have less. And some countries let you keep more of the money you make, and some countries let you keep less. And so we try to score all of that, and we collect a lot of data. And our job is, and we end up with an economic freedom index. And so some countries we use a 10-point scale. Some countries get nines, and some countries get threes. That's the project.
Okay. And Hong Kong's been number one in the index for quite a while. And one of our audience members would like to know, why don't other countries follow Hong Kong's example?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. In fact, that's the biggest question in the academic world, I think, related to economic freedom. There's a pretty decent consensus that countries that have private property and markets perform better. Hong Kong is a great example because it's performed exceptionally well using, and they're number one in the index. They've done very well. The question how you get it is like the one that we don't really know. Well, they got it. That's good for them. But how did they get it? And it turns out that there's not one simple answer. I will say that why most countries don't have it is because there are interest groups within every country that would stand to lose if you had more economic freedom. Because if you were running a state-owned enterprise, if you were running the government's monopoly, I don't know, wheat producer, and there are actually countries out there where there is a single wheat, usually wholesale entity, and they provide wheat for the whole flour for the whole country. If you were in charge of that, if you were the bureaucrat in charge of that, your status and your wealth and your income, your whole reason for being would take a huge hit if they privatize that. So within every country, there are interest groups or individuals who gain from the lack of economic freedom, and they're going to lobby to keep economic freedom from happening. So reform is always hard because of the interest groups that would try to protect their turf. So I can give many examples, but basically that's it. And so in Hong Kong's case specifically, and I don't know that this is advice that I would give, but they, in a sense, got lucky because they had a sort of benevolent dictator in the form of Sir John Cowperthwaite, who was the longtime appointed governor from England, who ran the place, and he just basically thought economic freedom was a good idea, and he sort of imposed it, and the interest groups who might have opposed the economic freedom that he was trying to give Hong Kong just didn't have any voice, and they couldn't do anything about it. I'm not advocating for dictatorships in any way because they usually don't turn out well. But in Hong Kong's particular case, they got lucky with a dictator. Unlike most countries who get dictators, they ended with one that wasn't, a total, tyrant. So that's how they got it there. I mean, but it's a different answer in every country, I'm afraid.
And this ties into a question somebody else had submitted regarding India's economic freedom. And they wanted to know, how do minimum support prices impact India's economic freedom score?
That's right out of the news right now, isn't it? So Policies like that would be negative. So a policy that has a minimum price support on agricultural products that acts like a subsidy to the farmers, that would be an interference in the operation of a free market. And so, to the extent those policies exist, and we do have a couple of variables in the index itself that would score that type of regulation, uh, your score would go down. That would be an interference. You're not letting market buyers and sellers determine prices. You're having a government dictate that. Obviously, it's a hot button political issue. I follow the news enough to know that there are street protests in India as we speak over this very issue. There are a lot of interest groups, going to the earlier answer. There's a big interest group in India, the farmers themselves, who benefit from those price supports, and they're going to do their best to stand in the way of any reform.
Okay. And this ties back into something you brought up with one of your previous answers about a dictatorship. One of our audience members would like to know what's your take on Singapore? Why don't you criticize Singapore's government in the index? I know in the video you talked about how they have really high economic freedom, but they have a lot to be desired on the political freedom side. Why isn't that something you address?
Well, I wouldn't want to live there. Personally speaking, I have a lot of problems with Singapore. Uh, I like my free speech a lot, and I use it on Facebook and Twitter, and just right now with you. And frankly, the free speech that I exercise would probably get me in trouble in Singapore. So I would not want to live there. The real answer, though, is that the scholarly answer is that there are indexes of political rights and civil liberties by Freedom House. The Rights Watch puts out like reports and such and so forth. When we started this project in the 90s, what we saw was that no one was doing a sort of scoring exercise for the more mundane things like buying and selling shoes. And so we didn't feel the need to get involved in political rights and civil liberties types of indexes because they were already out there, and they're good. We didn't think we would do them any better than already existed. We were trying to fill a void. With that, I always do worry though that we give the impression that we think economic freedom is the only thing that matters, and I don't believe that. It was just that from a scholarly point of view, we didn't see anyone else measuring economic freedom, which I do think is important and needs to be measured. I look at this as a complement to the scoring efforts by groups like Freedom House, who score for civil liberties. And Singapore and Hong Kong are both examples of countries that do well in our index, and rightly so, but they do fairly poorly in the civil liberties index.
You touched on it a little bit, but one of the live questions that just came in was, what's your inspiration? What was sort of the origin story for this project?
Well, it's a long story, and it actually predates me. I was in 1984. I was in high school, so this is not a story I'm telling from firsthand experience. There was a meeting, and Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning famous economist, was there, and they were having a debate about political freedom and civil liberties and economic freedom. And Friedman remarked or came to the conclusion that the lack of an economic freedom index and the lack of an actual quantitative measure of economic freedom was really hindering that debate because people had anecdotes, they had stories, they had a lot of biases, but no one had any hard data. We did have that at that point for civil liberties. Like we had indexes of civil liberties we could look at. We didn't have one for political or for economics. And so Milton convened a series of conferences. A few years later, I got involved as a graduate student, and I was just a nobody working, on what was a primitive computer at the time. But I got involved as the research assistant to a gentleman, Jim Gortney, who took it on to create this index, and I'm still working on it. And Jim's still working on it too, but it's my life's work, it turns out. And it's great, for young people who might be out there, like, you just never really know what arrow out of the dark. Because I never thought I'd be working on an economic freedom index. I went to graduate school. I'm going to, write papers, be a professor, but I kind of fell into this. But it does go back to Milton Friedman and this whole debate about economic freedom and political freedom and how they go together. But the need to measure it was the real origin story.
So I guess the question somebody has is, Why doesn't GDP fully encapsulate what economic freedom is for a nation? What's wrong with the GDP measure?
Well, I mean, in some sense, GDP is a fairly neutral thing. It is just the measure of all the stuff we make. We add up all the wheat and all the cars and all the plumbing and services, and we put dollar numbers and we add it all up. It is what it is. I don't, to the extent people want that stuff, to the extent people like, wheat flour and cars, and they like getting their pipes fixed by plumbers. GDP is a measure of good stuff. I mean, it's a measure of the stuff we want done in our world. We're not, out there making GDP just to make GDP. GDP is the word we give to stuff we want to have in our world. So I'm not a GDP hater. On the other hand, if we decided to make less GDP, if we decided it would be better to have less stuff, that's fine too. I mean, I'm not a GDP, worshiper. Um, Now, with that said, most people, I think, if I look at them, kind of like stuff. They like houses, they like cars, they like clothing, they like vacations, they like staying in hotels, they like fixing pipes that get broken. And to the extent GDP is measuring the stuff that we like to have in our world, more probably is better. And it turns out economic freedom is a pretty good way, giving people the freedom to engage in markets using their private property, and keeps the fruits of their labor. Having that system in place it turns out, a pretty powerful way to create GDP. And again, I'm not a GDP fetisher here. I'm just saying that GDP, to the extent it means the stuff we want to have in our world, it's really good at it. Um, you know, there's a lot of data out there though that says GDP is a pretty good stand-in for other things. Like if you cared about infant mortality, if you care about sexual discrimination, you care about how homosexuals get treated. If you care about anything that's not an obvious sort of so-called economic thing, guess what? Countries with more GDP per person, more richer countries, they got they tend to do better on those things too. So I don't want to. I don't think we should fetishize, if that's a word, GDP. But I'm not. I think we should, treat it for what it is. It's a measure of the stuff we wanted to do this year. We wanted to make cars this year. GDP is part of that.
And then what is the causal connection between economic freedom and lifespan?
Well, I think it goes for GDP. It's strong. I mean, the correlation is extraordinarily strong. It's one of the strongest correlations we have. If you look at the top 25% of the economic freedom index compared to the bottom 25%, sort of look at the extremes of the economic freedom world, it's about a 20-year, slightly less than 20-year difference in life expectancy. So the difference between living to say 80 versus living to say about 60. So people that are in the top 25%, that would be people like us in the United States, because we're in the more free quadrant. We live on average to 75, 80 years. People that are in that lower quadrant, the sort of Venezuela's of the world, Venezuela scores last. They're living on average to be 60. And that's a huge difference. That's 20 years. It's a quarter of my expected lifespan. It's the difference between living long enough to know your grandkids or not, or your great grandkids. Now, the causal connection is probably GDP, though. It's that we can make more stuff. Remember, GDP includes hospitals. It includes sewer systems, which take waste away from my house. It includes clean pipes that bring clean water into my house. It includes having the wealth to put scrubbers on our smokestack so we have less air pollution. It creates less lung cancer. It's on and on and on. All of that stuff that we call GDP. People are like, oh, GDP. Well, look, GDP is hospitals. It's X-ray machines. It's cancer treatments. And that's the stuff that makes us live longer. So I think the mechanism is through GDP. And again, I'm not fetishizing GDP, but again, GDP is like cancer. It's treatments. I mean, that's some really good stuff, and that's why we live long.
Okay. And then following up with more GDP, if a country's GDP were to fall, what would typically happen to that country's score?
But there's so nothing. I mean, per se, if that ceteris paribus, GDP is not in the index. The index is measuring tax rates, regulatory policies, monetary policies, trade, tariff policies, things like that. Just measuring the sort of institutional and policy infrastructure that exists. Now, that infrastructure tends to, if you have a highly economically free infrastructure, it tends to create more economic freedom or more GDP. But if GDP were to go down, if we had a recession, it doesn't necessarily mean the index would fall. Um, Now, what we do see sometimes, though, is that when you have a recession and that means GDP falls, uh, that governments sometimes react by taxing more, regulating more, or doing like the most of the government responses to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and 10, and 11. That Great Recession. Most of the government responses to that were deleterious to economic freedom. So, but the GDP falling didn't cause that. It was the policies that caused that.
Okay. And then what do you think of the way the United States developed their economic freedom? Do you think that was a good thing for us, or do you think it might have made some things worse?
Well, I'm gonna, one of the, well, it has a couple answers. Um, we inherited private property from England. I mean, when the English colonists and other colonists got here, we created private property. We can get into the Native American problem, but the fact is, we had a system based on private property from the beginning and markets. And the colonial rebellion was in large part a rebellion against the perceived overtax and overregulations that were coming from Parliament. So the country was sort of seeded with a sort of I don't want to use the word ideology, but it was sort of seeded with a set of ideas that were rooted in economic freedom. That, hey, we're gonna have private property, and doggone it, we can trade directly with the French or the Spanish. We don't need to go through England and so forth. So that kind of was an early set mindset here, and I think we benefited from that greatly. I kind of came up when I was younger. I was more of a fire breathing libertarian than I am maybe now. And I kind of, oh man, I hate the government. The government does all this stupid stuff. The post office can't deliver mail, blah blah blah. The government's terrible. Government's bad. And I mostly directed that to my own government. Like, the U.S. government's terrible, and I actually still think that mostly. But then I do this research for the last 30 years of my life about the rest of the world, and the fact of the matter is, taxes are higher in most countries, and uh, regulations are worse in most countries. Trade is less free in most countries. So I've actually developed a sort of grudging admiration for the United States and our ability for a sustained, like, 2 century period of time to be able to keep a system of private property and markets going this long, this well, is really an achievement. And that we're large and complex. I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore, it's like, oh, it's a little tiny city, whatever. We're talking about a huge multi-ethnic, geographically diverse, and with huge divisions between urban and rural, and race. And we've been able to keep our free markets more or less intact for this long. That's pretty cool. I have all kinds of complaints, but in comparison to most of the world, I've become sort of I don't want to say pro-American, but I have an admiration for what we've been able to achieve here.
Shifting gears a little bit, getting into sort of more of the statistical nitty gritty, since it is an empirical index, has there been any research done on the quality of the components of the index?
Well, uh, first of all, the components of the index are all international data sources. So, I mean, most of my data come from IMF, World Bank, uh, World Economic Forum, and things like that. And so they're being produced by huge international bureaucracies. And I'd be the last person to say the data that we get from these huge bureaucracies is perfect. But I mean, there are scores and scores of accountants whose job it is to create these numbers, and they get vetted out pretty well. And even in poor countries, the statistical offices are pretty professional. So there is measurement error in all data. Um, but we're using pretty official data. It's I think one thing it's kind of important to note it's not that Bob Lawson and Jim Gorton here are sitting in our offices, sort of kind of licking our fingers, put it to the wind, like I think Zimbabwe's going down this year. We just get data from the IMF for Zimbabwe or from the World Bank, and almost all of it's like that. And so the quality is what it is. But at some point, if it's good enough for the IMF, it's going to be good enough for me. And some of it's pretty bulletproof. Like the average tariff rate is just a bunch of numbers. You take the average. It's in a book. It's easy. That's measured quite precisely. Inflation is hard, and so there are some countries where I think the inflation rate is poorly measured. Argentina is one that comes to my mind immediately. But so there are some data sets that we know are more accurate than others. But I'm pretty confident with it. I will say something. This is too long of an answer, but there are people that don't like all of the variables we have. There are some people that think, "Oh, that variable shouldn't be there." And one thing, and okay, we could argue on this, but we give everyone the data in a big spreadsheet. So we've had scholars who disagreed with us on a particular variable or a particular component, and they'll take that component out and like, hey, I wonder how the index performs without that offending variable. We're scholars about this. We don't presume that we've got the one true perfect way to do this. So we're quite open to have other people rearrange our variables, take them out, add new ones if they found something they wanted to use.
So talking about change, I noticed over the last couple of years, there's been an emphasis of including gender into some of the report. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for some time we don't really look too much at the results we put the numbers in and the results, the chips fall where they fall. But at the same time, we did notice that some countries that we know don't have favorable treatment towards women, legally treatment towards women. We're doing pretty well, and you think about most economic policies, they're not gender specific. Like the tariff rate on shoes is the same for men and women. The inflation rate in the economy is the same for men and women. So most of the things that we measure, there isn't a difference between how that policy affects men versus how it affects women. But there are some economic policies where there are gender differences. So, for example, we have an area that measures property rights. We knew that there were some places that, for example, prohibited women from inheriting property. That it had to go to a male heir only, for example, or that a woman couldn't work at night without permission of her husband or father, things like that. And so these were legal restrictions, infringements, regulations on the freedom of women to participate in the market economy. And our measures didn't, for a long time, we didn't have them accounted for. So with the help of Rosemary Fike, who's a professor at TCU on the other side of town here, DFW, she got some really good data from the World Bank, and it wasn't easy to collect this data because the World Bank didn't make this data set very easy to use. And she collected data on about 40 different factors like inheritance rules, property rules, working rules, and we added that into our index. I was very pleased to do this. I think it's the right thing to do when 50% of the population has a regulation that says they can't work at night or can't inherit property. That's an egregious violation of freedom. And I was really pleased that we were able to integrate that. And not surprisingly, the countries that United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, these were countries that scored fairly high on our index before they took a decent hit. I mean, they didn't go down to the bottom and they shouldn't. I mean, the fact is, the United Arab Emirates is still a pretty free market economy, but they took a good hit because 50% of their population has got a lot of restrictions on them.
So we have about 3 minutes left, and I'm curious, uh, with the time remaining, what's the big takeaway you'd like people to walk away with from tonight?
Well, I've become an evangelist for data and for measurement and for empiricism. And it's not that empirics and data settle everything, but whether economic freedom is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether we should have capitalism or socialism, to use those loaded terms, is a debate that's been very, very hot for a long time. I mean, almost literally hot, like literal wars at sometimes over this question of capitalism versus socialism. And I think one of the things that the Economic Freedom of the World Index has done is that by injecting numbers, well, Hong Kong's a 9, Venezuela's a 3, the US is an 8.43 or something, whatever the number. By injecting numbers into it, I think we have the possibility of taking some of the heat out of that debate and injecting some light into the debate. And I hope that ideological socialists, ideological capitalists, everybody in between can pause on them for just a minute on their ideologies and say, hey, let's look at these numbers. These numbers say that Hong Kong's more capitalist and Venezuela's more socialist, and 160 countries in between them. Let's look at the numbers. And I think it has the possibility of taking some of the venom and animosity out of that, and I think that'd be a good thing for us.
Great. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, could you tell us a little bit about what the Bridwell Institute does and the mission?
Well, sure. For those who don't know, Derek used to work for me in the O'Neill Center, and we're now the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom, and we're a research center at SMU in Texas, Dallas, Texas. And in addition to the Economic Freedom Index that I work on with my colleague Ryan Murphy, we also are the home for the research team that works on a state Economic Freedom Index. And we also have in our house, our tent, a city level Economic Freedom Index. So the Bridwell Institute, we're trying to make it become known as the centerpiece place in the academic world for research on economic freedom, but it's this quantitative, data-driven index work on economic freedom. That's what we're trying to do.
Wonderful. And could you also tell us a little bit about your Amazon bestseller, Socialism Sucks?
Thank you. Well, the full title is Socialism Sucks. Two economists drink their way through the unfree world. I confess I'm drinking a small drink here. And Ben Powell, who's a professor at Texas Tech University, and I traveled to a lot of socialist countries, former socialist countries, and Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, China, Ukraine, Russia, Georgia, the country. And we wrote a fun book called Socialism Sucks. It's not an academic press. It's a book that's written for the masses. It's fun. There's plenty of stories of drinking, hence the subtitle. But we thought that we wanted to write a book that would try to marry our scholarly view of socialism and capitalism with sort of I don't know, Anthony Bourdain style travel and drinking blog. And we had a lot of fun with the book and did pretty well. We're very, very pleased with the outcome.
Sounds great, Bob. Thank you for the time this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Derek. It's great to hear.
And everybody out there in Zoom land, thank you for joining us tonight. Please stay well and safe, and please be good to each other. Have a good evening, everyone.